not often we get a chance to save a swamp, at least not in Ohio. But today, the Arc of Appalachia Preserve System is in partnership with Killbuck Watershed Land Trust to save this 157-acre wetland known as Killbuck Swamp in Holmes County, Ohio. The standing marshes and swamps of Killbuck Swamp have signature wildlife. Things like, amazing things, like swans, rails, bitterns, bald eagles, sandhill cranes, rafts of migrating and breeding ducks and geese. Fortunately, we have already received substantial award from a Clean Ohio grant. And now, with your help, the help of private donations, we can bring this Killbuck Swamp project right over the finish line. The Arc of Appalachia has saved in its history 7,000 acres in 22 preserves, all of them in the southern Appalachian part of Ohio. In our 26 years of wildlands preservation, we have saved remarkable scenery, beautiful and biodiverse landscapes such as old-growth forests, deep gorges, alkaline rare prairies, rockscapes and Hocking Hills. We've even saved a number of Native American earthworks that are over 2,000 years old, but we have never saved a swamp, not once. I have sat at 140 closing tables, and we have never bought a swamp, not because we didn't want to, but because in Ohio, there are so few left to save.
Historically, Ohio had 5 million acres of wetlands, which comprised 20% of Ohio's landscape. Today, only about 500,000 acres of wetlands remain in the state of Ohio. From an acreage perspective, we've lost 90%. Pre-settlement, almost every wetland was of the highest quality. Now, a very high percentage of our remaining wetlands are largely surrounded by development and agricultural fields.
The fact that Killbuck Swamp exists at all is actually a little bit of a miracle. The fact that Killbuck Swamp is for sale, that's even more astonishing. In fact, this project is so compelling that it drew the Arc of Appalachia right across Interstate 70 and far into northern Ohio for the first time in our 26 years of work. That's an extraordinary expansion for the Arc of Appalachia. But Killbuck Swamp is an extraordinary project. Once we became transfixed by its significance, we quickly identified Killbuck Watershed Land Trust as the best possible partner. They're already very, very active in this region. They oversee 10,000 acres of agricultural easements. 10,000 acres, and they already run 2 preserves in the immediate region, known as Baker Wetlands and Brinkhaven Barrens.
Nearly all the conservation work in Killbuck Watershed has been contained within the 5,000 plus acres of the Killbuck Marsh State Wildlife Area, which is located in the upper watershed in Wayne and northern Holmes County. In contrast, almost all of the wetlands in the lower watershed still remain in private hands. The Killbuck Swamp acquisition will bring long overdue conservation attention to the region and be the first nature preserve with facilities in the entire watershed. Killbuck's wetlands are a bird lover's paradise and a showcase for wildlife recovery. I've been birding the Killbuck for decades. Sandhill cranes, once extirpated from Ohio, are now breeding up and down the Killbuck. I can see them nearly every month of the year. Sandhill cranes mate for life and form tight bonds. Their family and courtship rituals are sometimes elegant, and their bugling calls can be heard a long distances, a real call of the wild. The trumpeter swan disappeared from Ohio in the early 1800s, but thanks to a late 20th century reintroduction effort, I now see breeding swans on the larger waters of the Killbuck, including the Killbuck Swamp acquisition site, which hosted a pair this year. A notable state-threatened bird that finds refuge in the Killbuck is the least bittern. This rare bittern is the smallest heron in the entire world and requires intact cattail marshes of at least 5 acres in size to be able to successfully breed. Least bitterns are often called the cuckoos of the marsh, with their soft cooing emanating from the cattails. But when it comes to wildlife, what is below the water level is every bit as important as what is above.
A recent inventory of Killbuck Swamp's fish by Brian Zimmerman, the author of A Naturalist's Guide to Fishes of Ohio, turned up some very interesting characters. Perhaps the rarest species that he found was the fry of the state-threatened lake chubsucker. Originally found in many of Lake Erie's bays and harbors, it has essentially vanished from this core habitat. But here in Killbuck watershed, it can still be found in good numbers. Two fish species that Brian found in high numbers at Killbuck Swamp are unique to wetlands and thus are uncommon across most of Ohio. They are the central mud minnow and the bowfin. Both of these fish species have a very unique ability to breathe air, allowing them to live in marsh waters, which are dangerously low in oxygen for most fish species.
Dotted with buttonbush and floating mats of spatterdock, Killbuck Swamp supports an absolutely stunning suite of wildlife, both common and rare. Each species brings not only color, but the quintessential sounds of a swamp. When most people think of Ohio, modern Ohio, we think farm fields, soybean crops, corn, bustling cities. The last thing we think of is swamps and marshes, but it wasn't always this way. Ohio used to be very wet. I mean, extremely wet. In fact, Ohio used to be distinguished by its extensive wetlands. So, of course, the question begs, what happened? Well, it's really all about our croplands and our farm fields, because you see, when you have wet soil, that wet soil is very slow to warm up in the spring, and it's very low in oxygen. This is terrible for growing corn and soybeans and wheat in our early days. And so the farmers had to get that water off, and they had to get that water off fast. Beginning in the 1840s and accelerating to the turn of the century, this drainage was accomplished by digging open ditches, by channelizing, straightening our streams and creeks, and deepening them, most importantly, and laying thousands of miles of clay tiles. We were so thorough in draining Ohio's wetlands for one simple reason. Wetland soils, once drained, are among the most fertile soils on the planet. In fact, I think this is so interesting. Of the two states of the nation that have lost the highest proportion of their wetlands, one is California, and guess what? The other one is Ohio. In fact, Ohio has the highest percent of drained croplands in the entire United States. Just take a look at this map. This is the map of the pre-European settlement primeval wetlands of Ohio. Over here in the northwest part of the state was the Great Black Swamp. It covered 10 counties, everything from, in the west, Defiance and Van Wert, all the way to Sandusky counties, 120 miles in width. Just a little bit to the south was the St. Mary's River system, covering Mercer, Wyandotte, and Auglaize counties. Today, pretty much gone. We know it as St. Mary's Lake. Sandusky Plains was a 30,000-acre prairie sloughs covering Wyandotte and Marion counties. Some wet, some dry, mostly wet. Ashtabula and Trumbull counties boasted bogs, fens, and marshes, a huge complex of wetlands. And then, of course, there's the famous Darby Plains, 400 square miles, covering Union, Madison, and Franklin County of dry and wet prairie combinations. You've all heard of Buckeye Lake. Well, Buckeye Lake used to be known as the Big Swamp, an extensive wetlands until it was flooded to form the recreation area that we know today. Down in southeastern Ohio, over much of that quarter of the state, was often known as medium and small-sized flats, that is, small marshes and swamps, left behind by the clay deposits from the pre-glacial Taze River. Now take a look at the map of Ohio's remaining wetlands. This is the current map of wetlands in Ohio. It's as if most of them have vanished. All of the wetlands we don't see were either dammed or drained before any of us were born. It's hard to grasp the scale of what we've lost, and most of us don't know enough to even try. To some extent, those of us alive today are suffering from what I call wetlands amnesia. Look at this small streak of blue on the map. That's Killbuck watershed, with thousands of acres of associated wetlands. Remarkably, still on the map. Maybe not in all of its primeval glory, because we have done everything we possibly could to try to drain it. Fortunately, it's an incredibly resilient watershed. Killbuck seems like it just wants to be a swamp, and much of it still is. Here's the point. Killbuck watershed is one of the last places in Ohio where it's not too late to save Ohio's rich legacy of wetlands. The Arc of Appalachia and Killbuck Watershed Land Trust are making the Killbuck Swamp Project one of our priority wildlands acquisitions for 2021 and 2022. Our goal is to raise the remaining balance for Killbuck Swamp's acquisition, development, and stewardship. We ask you, please be a patron of our efforts by going to killbuckswamp.org and make a donation. Here on the website you will find progress reports on how the campaign is going. If this project goes as briskly as I suspect it will and hope it will, it won't be long before you can actually visit this park and preserve for yourself. You have to bring your binoculars because we will be developing the site with nature trails, a bird blind, birding trails, and even a canoe and kayak launch. If enough of us care about our rich wetland legacies here in Ohio, the Killbuck Swamp acquisition will be just the beginning of our good partnership in the Killbuck watershed. Friends, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of marshes and swamps that are still in private hands, and more are coming up for sale every year. Yes, I know, Ohio has lost a tremendous, an astonishing amount of its wetlands, and we can't change that past. But we can change our future if we just save the best of what is left. I ask you, what would Ohio look like if our generation went down in history and said yes to our highest calling, yes to stewardship, yes to beauty, yes to preserving life in all of its splendid diversity? I invite you to help us find out.